Steve, this is just for continuity's sake, it's June 25th, 2025. My name is Paul Ortiz. I'm a former director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, now a professor at Cornell. I'm talking to Dr. Steve Kirn. This is a continuation of an oral history interview we did. On Steve, the first interview, you were talking quite a bit about, both your Ph.D. program at the University of Florida, different advisors you worked with, especially what you saw in terms of the activism and organizing, social justice organizing on campus at the University of Florida in those days when you were a graduate student, and also how one or more of your academic mentors was involved in actually what became the United Faculty of Florida, the first faculty union in Florida. So as we left that first interview, you were matriculating and getting ready to think about the job market. So I wonder if we could kind of start there. When you were finishing your doctorate, what year would that have been? Was that the mid 70s by now?
No, I finished the work in 1973, the fall semester. Everything was completed, but I had to, because of the timing of when they did commencement and so forth, I got to walk across the stage, as it were, in March of 73.
Okay, very cool. Now, March in 73, of course, the Vietnam War is still, kind of winding down. There's still a lot of protests nationally. In the first interview, you talked a lot about your initial experiences working as an activist with some of the movements and stuff. How were things looking by 1973? Was the movement kind of slowing down? Was it speeding up? Was it in stasis?
Well, I should say that last year I spent actually in St. Louis, because I was in the clinical psychology program, and part of our requirement for graduating was a year's supervised clinical experience. And so
Okay.
my wife, Katrina, and I met my wife here. We both got our PhDs. She started a year after me and then lapped me in getting her PhD because she's much smarter than I am, and got hers done faster. But we were both, we managed to find an assignment where both of us could work together at the same place, which was the Malcolm Bliss Mental Health Center in St. Louis. So the 72 to 73 time frame was spent in St. Louis rather than here on campus at UF.
Okay.
There was stuff going on in St. Louis, as you might expect. We were just down the road. We lived just down the road from Washington U. And so there were lots of things going on there because that was a very active campus as well. But we were not here for that year. And when I came back, it was mainly to come back to have my parents and her parents come back and have us both walk across the stage and wave at the camera and that sort of thing.
Very cool. Now, what kind of, did the department at UF in those days have a kind of a job market program or preparation, getting ready for like the next steps? Or were you just kind of thrown out and, hey, apply for jobs?
The latter.
The latter, okay.
Yeah, no, there was no, that would have been a new concept at the time, that there was kind of a career pathing option that would kind of help you move into that. You were pretty much on your own. On the other hand, that was an era, particularly in clinical psychology, just to put it into some historic context, 1965 was when the Comprehensive Community Mental Health Centers Act was passed in Congress. And the idea is to have a comprehensive community mental health center, as its title would suggest, serving every person within some reasonable distance in all the 50 states. It turned out that in terms of getting to Kentucky, which is my home state, and was where our first job was, starting as soon as we got our PhDs, was in Kentucky. Kentucky was the first state in the Union to have its complete system of comprehensive community mental health centers completed serving every part of a kind of combined urban, like for Louisville and Lexington and Owensboro and sort of larger sized cities, and then rural areas in the Appalachians and so forth. So we had 16 service centers that served all of those different counties. There's 120 counties in Kentucky. And Katrina and I managed to land a job as we finished our assignment in St. Louis with the North Central Comprehensive Mental Health Center, which was in Elizabethtown, which is about 50 miles south of Louisville. And so our job, when we started, this was our first real job, since that's, I think, our focus for today, was we were kind of circuit riding psychologists based in Elizabethtown, which is just outside of Fort Knox. For anybody who needs to anchor it somewhere, Fort Knox was just down the road. So I would drive east each morning for about an hour to places like Graywick and Gravel Switch, places like that. And but also Springfield, which is where Abraham Lincoln was born, and Lebanon and Bardstown and places like that. And Katrina would drive west to places like Brandenburg and Litchfield and so forth. And so that was our first assignment. We were basically circuit riding psychologists. Although Katrina was actually the service center supervisor, I was truly a circuit riding guy. So I would go to our clinics in each of these places and do my psychologist thing, which was either counseling, but most often it was sort of diagnostic stuff, and then passing it off because we weren't there to do therapy or things like that. I did a lot of work with the schools, and I would go in and do these diagnostics where assessing kids for things like learning disabilities and ADHD stuff. We didn't call it that then, but kids who had trouble staying attentive in school and so forth. But that diagnosis was defined later. But that it becomes important in terms of what we'll talk about later as we talk today. Is that I would go to all these different little towns, and I would be on the road from like leaving at 7 in the morning and getting home at 7 at night and driving all in the meantime and trying to avoid the tractors who were parked in the middle of these 2-lane roads that I was driving around as they were surveying the fields and seeing how the tobacco was growing and things like that. But I finally came to realize that I could do learning disability assessments from then until hell froze over. And after I'd done it and said, yeah, well, here's what this child needs, but there really wasn't anybody on site to deliver it in many cases.
Wow.
So what I ended up doing was I kind of drifted, and this is why it becomes important. I sort of drifted towards saying, you know what, teachers, you spend 5 days a week for 8 or 9 months a year with these kids. And here's what I'm going to do. I can teach you in a few days session how to be really good diagnosticians in about 90 to 95% of the cases, because you see them day in and day out instead of me seeing them for an hour and a half, doing all my little test kit things. So I ended up becoming a consultant to teachers rather than a direct service provider. In that role of shifting the mindset from being the service deliverer to the clinician to being the consultant to teach people who are practitioners in their own field, like as teachers, to figuring out what it was that needed to be done, and then providing them with some tools that they could intervene on their own on a day in, day out basis. And that was a real mindset changer for me of thinking about how I could contribute. Even though I knew how to do all the tests, and I came in with my little bag with all my test kits and blocks and things for kids to draw and all this kind of stuff, that became less important than seeing what the children were doing on a day in, day out basis and helping teachers in these rural counties that we were working in to understand how they could intervene and how they could diagnose and what kinds of things they could do on the spot starting the next day there.
What were the things that the students or children needed, as you're driving around and talking to the students and the teachers? What were the most important needs of the kids?
Well, in some cases, it was simply controlling behaviors, getting them concentrated and focused on particular things. And so working with teachers to figure out how you could create engaging kind of experiences that would sort of pull the students in, even for limited periods of time, and then rewarding them in terms of how they might be able to capitalize on that, and gradually introducing more of the academic kinds of things they were trying to do. So it was changing the kinds of exercises that were going on in the community, in the classroom. Uh, it was finding defining students who had perhaps perceptual problems. It was defining students who had they were simply developmentally disabled, and so they were unable to comprehend the stuff. And then getting them into some supervised treatment facilities where they could best have their needs addressed, instead of just having the teacher frustrated with them all the time and saying, why aren't you paying attention, or why can't you learn this? Everybody else learned it. And finding out that there was some perceptual problem that they had. So
Yeah.
it was kind of matching, it was teaching students, teaching the teachers how to say, okay, let's break this thing down. What are the kinds of disabilities? They get frustrated because they couldn't get the holistic thing happening, but it was helping them to understand, to kind of break it down into the segments that were the particular barriers, and then linking them with either educational specialists who might be available in the county school system that they were in, or teaching them stuff that they could do in their own classrooms that would help the students be able to adapt to it, because the students wanted to succeed as well, and they were equally frustrated that they were failing. They weren't stupid. They had either perceptual problems or motor problems, but some had cognitive problems. Some had really, they were disabled mentally. Their IQ, to use the generic term, was not up to, they were kind of borderline. They'd be like in the 70 range, which is sort of borderline between, to use just the professional term, but between where, they were sort of developmentally disabled and where they really needed help. But it was using the teachers who were on the site day in and day out to sort those students out, so that we could then focus them on the other systems that we had, the other systems we had available to them. Whether it was a roving teacher or something like that, or teaching things that their parents could do with them after they got home from school. It was simple kinds of interventions, sometimes complicated, but we would regularly encounter children who were clearly, to use the generic term, mentally retarded is the term that would be used, who were living up these hollers, as they were called back in Kentucky, which is kind of where creeks went back up into the hills.
Yeah.
They'd be sitting there, and along with potentially a grandparent who'd been sitting there for 30 years, because they said, oh yeah, it's Grandpa Jones. He'd been like that his whole life. And we didn't want the children to find the same thing happening, but I was trying to get it done. I could not do it myself, but the
Yeah.
teachers were there day in and day out.
Now, if you could, I know you alluded to this earlier, Steve, but could you describe the kind of organizational structure that you were working in and how it intersected with the school district, like in the state? Because I'm trying to figure out, like, how would the remediation work here? How would, are there interdepartmental collaborations going on, things like that?
Well, sometimes yes and sometimes no. That was the next direction that all of us thinking as a consultant more than a clinician. I mean, having the clinical skills that and figuring out the ones you could pass on to the people who were on the ground day in and day out. But the fundamental structure was, you had a statewide mental health system. We had 16 comprehensive community care centers that served different parts of the 120 counties. So with 16, it'd be like each one would have maybe 10 counties, whatever. And they would set up depending on what the area was. So, for example, a large city like Louisville would have a different structure. Louisville had 16 of its own service centers divided by neighborhoods. If you were out in central or eastern Kentucky, you might be serving 20 counties. So you would tend to have a service center in each area. And then you might have a psychiatrist or a psychologist or social worker who'd be coming in. They probably were not, if they were in a sort of a larger city area, like a place like Danville, let's say, or Hazard in eastern Kentucky and so forth, they would have a permanent staff based in that center. But typically there would be clinics set up in the smaller counties around, and people like myself would come in 1 or 2 days a week. It would drive in from the center base and then come back out. But that was the fundamental structure. But we were the first state in the union to have that complete coverage, so that every single county had someone that they could go to in reasonable driving distance to get to a clinic, whether for whatever kind of help they need. Maybe it was a refill on psychiatric meds. Maybe it was seeing a psychologist. Maybe it was doing the set of IQ testing or developmental disabilities testing or things like that. And we would work in the schools and so forth. But different centers did a more or less better job of that than another, and it varied tremendously. So, for example, the one in Louisville, which after spending time in Elizabethtown in central Kentucky, both Katrina and I ended up in Louisville with a place which was then called River Region. Louisville is called the River City because it's right on the Ohio River. If you cross the river, you're in Indiana, and from downtown Louisville. But the River Region was at that time, the largest comprehensive community mental health center in the entire United States. In terms of staffing, in terms of the range of capabilities that it had and so forth. And drawing on what I had been doing on a consulting basis, Katrina ended up being a service center supervisor. We had 16 service centers scattered around the Louisville metro area. There were 7 counties, but they basically surrounded Louisville. It was basically a metro area, for lack of a better term. They were not far from Louisville. I ended up working in preventive services, which was almost unheard of in the nationwide system. So we were doing even basic research, almost, not almost, but university level research. We had a series of Ph.D. psychologists and psychiatrists and other physicians. And we were doing work in areas like suicide prevention, trying to intervene. Instead of just sitting there waiting for people who were in distress to come to you, we were trying to find out what could community mental health centers do to intervene in advance. So I'll give you a concrete example. We did a research study which got a good deal of attention at the time on the effectiveness or lack thereof of PSAs, public service announcements, the things which at the time would be, if you were watching TV, after there were still stations that would do the flag and play the national anthem before they signed off for the night. But during the rest of the time, there were incentives that the federal government had provided to take some of their commercial time and use it for these PSAs. And we wanted to find out whether those things actually worked or not.
So by PSAs, you mean things like
friends
don't let friends drive drunk?
Sure. Or in this case, it was around suicide. If you're feeling tears, and we had set up a network of kind of a psychological 911 network. If you're in distress, here's who to call, but also linking with what was then becoming a crisis line. It wasn't fully 911 yet in that era. It eventually became that. But a number that you could call if you were in distress, and 24 hours a day, 365, somebody was going to answer it, and we would train them in terms of how to respond to you. So, but the question was, did the PSAs actually work? And so we said, well, does it prompt any particular behaviors that people exhibit? So what we did is we set up a network. This was part of what I worked on. And I'll give you another example of something else I was working on simultaneously. But we set up a network of all the hospitals, all of the professional caregivers that we could identify, physicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, schools, school counselors, uh, uh, other kinds of churches and so forth, who people might solicit. And then we worked with the TV and radio stations to set up a controlled experiment where we knew exactly, we had 15-second, 30-second, and 60-second PSAs, either on, just audio for radio, video and stuff for TV. And we worked with the TV stations to know exactly which one was going to be put up when. We had multiple versions of each one at different lengths at different times of day. So we had that kind of controlled experiment. But then we had a way to monitor all the calls that were made to all of the networks that we could find out that were crisis lines, and to have a reporting network, not of who exactly it was, but how many people solicited them and how long, what was the lag time between we ran the PSA and we saw an effect down the line for all these different systems. It was an extraordinary, no one had ever done it before. It was stations did PSAs because it seemed like the right community thing to do and because the federal government required it. So we were able to demonstrate what length of, it's far too complicated to go into. I've already gone too far into it. But if you get the idea, we're trying to say what works, how long does it have to be, when does it have to be shown, who do people respond to, how long, what's the lag time between running the PSA and getting some kind of measurable response, and which kinds of things work. It was the first time anyone had ever done that kind of research. PSAs were simply done because it seemed like the right thing to do.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the research and training folks, and you mentioned earlier the 24/7 helpline. Now that you've obviously a few decades to think about. I mean, how would you kind of evaluate that network now in terms of how many people it affected, or
Well, just to summarize it quickly, it had an impact. There were mixed, we found mixed results. Some ads worked better than others. It did not seem to be profoundly length related, although the 15-second ones were a bit less effective than the ones that could make more of a point, or to define a situation for someone that they could say, oh yeah, that's me, and then to give them something they're supposed to do. We just couldn't do it enough times. So we learned things like that, but the results were complex. And as they often say in this, more research is needed, which is always the concluding statement in every study you've ever done in your life. But we were able to point people to, here's the times when it seems people are peaking, and we had clinical analyses of when people would tend to be most active, especially if they were going to take their own life or hurt themselves or just go into some deep depression. And so we kind of knew that, but we were able to match kind of length of situations and the kind of content that was in there. Some things seemed to work better than others, but it was not a simple relationship. Like if you have one person who's in great distress versus somebody, a caregiver, who's saying, if you're feeling this, here's what you should do. Don't feel crazy about it. You're experiencing something that many people experience. Here's a number to call. There's someone waiting there to help you and who will simply listen to you and not preach to you. I mean,
wow,
those kinds of things. But it was the results, because this was like the first time this study had ever been done. And so we were kind of trailblazing to really raise what are the research questions that need to be explored further. But see how different. I mean, this was this connection between being here as a grad student at UF and being a practitioner. But I wasn't sitting around doing therapy and having people tell me about how depressed they. I mean, I did it, and I sort of knew how to do it, but I wasn't very good at it, I didn't think. And I thought I was a little bit better at the other things. The other thing we were doing at the same time, by the way, Paul, was this was the time in the mid 70s when the Jefferson County Public Schools in Louisville, which is where we were at that point, were being directed by the federal courts to do busing to integrate schools across the county. So students who could see their neighborhood school by looking down the street were having to get on bus and ride 45 minutes to the other end of town. And you can imagine how happy parents were about that. Um, but it was the way that was mandated in terms of integration. And so again, the role that I played was in preventive services was setting up what amounts to a management information system that linked our 16 service centers throughout the seven county region, I'm sorry, of Louisville, a person-to-person connection between the 356 schools, both parochial or religious. Louisville's a very big Catholic community, and the Catholic school system was a big deal. But between them and the public school system, so there was a one-on-one contact, not just a number for a counselor in a school to call, but rather that they had a specific person who had visited their school and met all the teachers, so that if they had a problem with a student or they were concerned about, they would call Steve Kirn, if I was working in that center, to say, Mary is really having a problem here. What should I do? And they had a person-to-person contact. So we had 16 service centers linked to 356 schools with a person-to-person contact with each school and each service center, not just a phone number to the service center. And I set that. My job was to set that up.
Wow.
So we could create a network where we could intervene quickly, find out where there were problems, where there was particular issues, where students were not showing up, the counselors could intervene. But as part of that, I had to train our clinicians in our service centers, our 16 service centers in the Louisville region, to be consultants rather than clinicians, not rather than, in addition to, so that they could work through the counselors, because they could never see all the children that were needed.
Right.
So that's how this is important in terms of where we go in the further conversation. Is I kept shifting away from direct clinical intervention to thinking about how do we maximize the impact across larger networks. And what that meant was thinking of it is changing your mindset from clinician to consultant, because it's not very different, but they overlap, but it's a different skill set. It's teaching the teacher as opposed to teaching. And it's a different thing.
What were the problems, Steve? You mentioned in Louisville proper, this was a time period when, most Southern school districts had resisted school integration as long as they possibly could. And then there would be lawsuits, counter lawsuits. Eventually in the early 70s, a lot of states are implementing kind of remediated, I guess you'd say remediation programs. So you're kind of, it sounds to me like you were in the crosshairs in certain ways as a clinician, both as a practitioner, but also as a person who can kind of step back and see. I mean, what were the challenges in that setting, as opposed to the earlier settings when you're talking? Obviously, in Louisville, you're not working with people who live in hollows. You're working in a different kind of situation. What were the challenges during that period?
Well, fundamentally, I mean, some of them, even for people who were not. First of all, I would say desegregation and integration are two separate things. Desegregation, you can sort of impose. You say, okay, you're going to go here, you're going to go here, done. And here's what the mix of the students are that you end up with. Integration is an entirely different thing. It's making all that work.
Yeah.
You can physically move students around, but that's not the same thing. And that is sort of where the problem came. So you would have a mix of people who were opposed to busing, let's say, for very different kinds of reasons. One was they didn't really they wanted their kids to go to school with all white students. Um, there were other people who were not opposed to the fundamental concept of integrating schools, but had real problems with, as I used the example earlier, with sending when you were in walking distance to your neighborhood school,
Yeah.
to get up and ride a school bus across town, which would easily, even in a city the size of Louisville, which is kind of a mid-sized city, you could be 30 or 40 minutes one way. And so these parents are saying, wait, not time out. This is nuts. We can't, this is gonna, first of all, we have to adjust our entire lives around this schedule and so forth. So there was a mix kind of separating out people who were simply opposed to the very idea. There were people who were racist. Let's face it. I mean, it was, and the city had pretty much divided. In Louisville, kind of, it had uh, there had the prior to during the 1960s, things changed. But prior to then, the Black community was primarily centered in the center city, closest to downtown, often in projects that were built after World War II and so forth. And the west end of Louisville and the east end of Louisville, east end called the Highlands, because literally you went up this big hill to get up to the ones on the east end. The houses were absolutely identical. My parents and their parents some lived in the west end, some lived in the east end, and so, but the houses were literally exactly the same houses, the same builders were building them. So
Wow.
the housing stock in both the east and the west end was virtually identical. And there was no stigma to where it was, but the whites were in the west end and the east end, the blacks were in the center.
Okay.
And we didn't have, I mean, we didn't know what a Hispanic was, basically. I mean, it didn't exist. I remember when the first Chinese restaurant opened in Louisville. To give an idea, there were none. It was all
Yeah.
exotic to us. Fried rice was what? Um, uh, anyway, but then during urban renewal, the city tore down and displaced many of the people who were in, and it was really pretty miserable places actually in the center city. And thanks to the Louisville Realtors Association at the time, they tended to move all of the blacks into the west end of town, which was the lowlands down by the river on the west end of town. And the whites who lived there moved to the east end, and the ones who were already in the east end stayed there. And the center city basically had nowhere for anybody to live. It became a kind of a commercial district, but there was virtually no housing there at all. What remained was primarily black or poor whites. But much of the housing was simply torn down. So it was kind of a wasteland with a few tall buildings in it. So this is, but the dynamic is that the city kind of split apart. West End black, East End white, and little civic effort or resources or services, no hospitals, very few services. The grocery stores moved out of the West End. None of those kinds of things existed in the West End. And so if you were black, which was increasingly what it became, you would have to go into the center of town where the hospital complexes and so forth were to get any kinds of services. And what simultaneously happened is that the schools, there was underinvestment in the schools. So the schools in the West End were truly under-resourced, and the money flowed disproportionately to the white schools in the East End.
Yeah. Well, this seems to be a challenge. I was just, at a conference where education was one of the major themes. And, there are colleagues from other countries, and they said, we just can't get our heads around your public education system. Your system, in contrast to most public systems in the entire world, finds ways to distribute greater amounts of public resources to your affluent school districts away from the ones that really need support. and they were kind of giving us a hard time about it. And I said, well, I don't create education policy, and so I can't really, I can, the best they'll tell us is we'll vote for someone else, but that doesn't really help. But it does seem to be a peculiarity of the American public school system. You hear this story over and over again. When I was a grad student, we interviewed a lot of retired African American teachers, people who had started their teaching careers around the time of World War II or right after. And they kind of gave us the same, a lot of the same analysis. I don't remember I didn't work in Louisville, but we worked in cities like Birmingham and Tuskegee, Tallahassee, Jackson. And there, the story, a lot of African American parents and educators actually preferred their own schools. And they said, if it was up to us, we simply would have gotten more resources, because the first, of course, as with the civil rights movement, the first move was equalize the resources. We don't live in your neighborhoods, you don't live in ours. We don't really, that's unfixable, but simply equalized resources. But then that was, 15 years later, that had not happened. And so the busing becomes, in some ways, a kind of a tragic outcome of this long resistance, right?
Right. Well, and I mean, you can't take it out as you would well know, having done that kind of work, out of the entire social context. I mean, so what's happening at home when the kids leave the school? I mean, let's say in an ideal world, you would do a virtually perfect distribution of resources to Black schools and white schools, to use the example we were just using. The question then, what happens outside? What kind of support is there? What sort of background are the parents and the families coming from? And not just because of what they would like to do, but what are they able to do? Because maybe they're both working outside the home. Maybe it's a single family home. Is there a network of things? Are there people who have it, just to put it, to oversimplify, who have the time on their hands to join the PTA and do volunteer work at the school? Because they're in a single wage earner family, and and mom, because practically speaking, that's what it was then. I'm not being sexist. I'm just saying that's the way it was. Women were at that era less likely to be working outside the home than they were. It was typically a standard nuclear family, male wage earner, mom at home, takes care of the kids in the house and stuff like that. That was much more prevalent inside the white communities than it was in the Black communities, not because of choice necessarily, but because of probably a history of how they had been treated before, but also practicalities in terms of what it took to simply put food on the table. So it was just an entirely different thing. Kids might come home to nobody being at home versus the mom being there and taking them off to whatever, softball practice or whatever it happened to be. It was a different network. It was a different world. And that was, but it tended to be self-reinforcing, so that the kids were struggling. They weren't attaining as much. They were under-resourced to start with. And that was just a shameful thing that just did not get fixed regularly. Despite people protesting about it and so forth, it did not get fixed. There was not the will at the political level to equalize those kinds of things in a really meaningful fashion. And in fact, to equalize them in a way that would actually allocate more resources to the underserved schools, because that's where the resources were most needed, because they didn't have, let's say, the home network that would support them as well. So it was a very complex issue, partially racist, partially tradition, partially family structure, partially where the schools were located and the age of the schools. So the expansion in Louisville, for example, was heading to the east and south. So if you went to the east and south of Louisville, which were predominantly white, they had brand new schools, brand new facilities, everything that you needed. The Black kids were typically in the older schools, because West Louisville, down by the river, was where Louisville really started, because they call it River City. In fact, there's a beer there called Fall City.
Right.
Because Louisville was built at the falls of the Ohio, where the river drops 39 feet in the space of about a mile. But the West End was kind of where the city got set up. So everything down there was older, including school buildings and facilities, housing, stock, everything like that. But that's where the blacks ended up. So they started off with 1 foot in a ditch. And the explosion, and you being a past Gainesvillian, would know that we have a similar situation where we have the east side of Gainesville, which has a higher proportion of Black, African American folks, and the west side of Gainesville, which is like a cannon pointed to the west. The expansion is all going out to the west. And that sort of dynamic existed in Louisville back when I was growing up.
Okay. Well, Steve, now you had this is really fascinating, and I think really important ground to cover and to think about. Um, it's interesting because when when you would share with me when I was still at UF, your work, in the public or private sector, you often would talk about your work with Sears and kind of more corporate HR work. How did you end up transitioning eventually from the school district work or working with kids, teachers, parents, to the corporate world? How did was that like an accident? Was that planned? Was that something, hey, I got to put food on the table kind of thing? Or all the above, maybe?
Well, I'd like to tell you that I had this strategic career path mapped out in advance, but I would be lying. I brought along some props. Can I use a prop to help?
Yes. Oh, yes.
So this was what I imagined when I was in graduate school, that I would be this kind of clinician in a white coat
Okay.
and so forth. And doing that sort of thing. And would have my little notepad and things like that I could take notes on and so forth. And that lasted for a while, but this was kind of me launching out of graduate school and thinking that's what I'm going to do. And I didn't get into things like in St. Louis, where they had the 500-year flood hit St. Louis the year that we were there, and
Yeah.
working in disaster relief. But that's another story. So I did that. But then I've already told you the story now about how that transitioned from direct clinician
Yeah.
to indirect consultant and so forth. So I did that, but then River Region, which is the name of the mental health center in Louisville, being the first, Kentucky being the first state in the union to have its comprehensive community mental health center system set up, which was set up under the Kennedy administration. It was proposed in 63, but it was kind of really been implemented to the next two Congresses up through 65. And it was done funding with 90% federal funding and 10% local and state funding, with a plan that would go from 90 to 10 to 80-20 to 70-30 and so forth, until it was ultimately in some kind of balance. Well, they got the declining part of the federal thing right. It went from 90 to 80 to 70 to 60. They never got this part right on the state and local side. So the fact is that River Region, despite the fact that it had its own huge psychiatric hospital and all kinds of other stuff, groundbreaking kind of things we were doing, basically went bankrupt.
Wow.
And so I had to get preventive services. We said we can't afford to do that. We got to do direct clinical services. And by then I had kind of moved away from the direct clinical line. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, was that ever a part of because you mentioned the Kennedy administration, I'm thinking people like Sergeant Shriver, who was kind of the idea person for some of this, but a bit later, was the projects that you were working on, were they ever connected to the war on poverty under LBJ, or was that kind of a separate?
It was pretty much a separate path.
Okay.
I mean, they weren't conflicting, but they were parallel, I guess is what I would say. They weren't, but there was, it was really done through the mental health funding network
Right.
rather than through other broader kinds of things. Anyway, so that got us into the 70s. And so I had to get another job, and I went back to my undergraduate school, which is Bellarmine College. At that time, it's now Bellarmine University, which is a private liberal arts school. It was an archdiocesan college at the time, with about 1,600 students, but a standard small liberal arts college thing. That was what they did, primarily with students who were first generation to go to college and so forth. So I ended up getting a teaching job there. And my wife and I set up a private clinical practice nearby the campus where we did clinical work. So I went back to my roots, but also had a regular job teaching psychology at the school. And in a place like this, you don't get to specialize much. Like there were 4 people in the psychology department. And so I had, during the time that I was there, 9 separate courses that I taught. Everything from intro psych to personality theory and research to organizational behavior. Remember that last one because that's important. And I had to be an expert in everything. And when they asked me to teach organizational behavior, I said, "What's that?" Because it was called industrial and organizational psychology at that point. The term organizational behavior didn't even exist. So I had to go out and read up on it because I was going to have to teach it. And we had an MBA program by the time. And so I was teaching all these things. And somehow or other, because it was a new field, and we were in Louisville was the home to General Electric's largest manufacturing plant in the world. It was just down the road from Bellarmine. And they employed over 20,000 people daily. This place, they built all their major appliances were built there. So washers and dryers, refrigerators, ranges, you name it, they built it all right there. And and during the time, and again, another anecdote just to give you an idea of how these things happened that I didn't anticipate. I'm teaching in the MBA program, and we had a program that was focused on people who were practicing managers. And that was the group I was teaching in the evenings. And many of them came from either Ford, which has 2 plants in Louisville. They build all the F-150s, and the Explorers are all built in Louisville. They still are, by the way. And then GE's making all their major appliances. So I had these people were coming in. But GE was starting its first 800 24/7 helpline. And some of my students came to me who were practicing managers with like 15, 20 years experience. And I'm trying to figure it out. I didn't know anything about it. I'm making it up. I was saying, "So what do you think about that?" It was my standard fallback position. But some of them came to me and said, "We're setting up this 800 helpline for anybody who's having a problem with their GE major appliance. They can call, and we have people who have trained. And they were just setting up the open office thing, with cubicles and with people sitting with little padded cubicles and maybe a headset. And my students came to me and said, we're putting these sort of fabric panels on the inside of the cubicles. You're a psychologist. What color should they be?" And my reaction was, beats hell out of me. I mean, shouldn't you talk to an interior designer or something like that? And I said, but they said, no. We want to find out what you're a psychologist. You're supposed to know this stuff. So I said, okay, well, what kind of environment do you want to create? So I set up a little group meeting. We talked about what is going to make this most effective. Is it calming? These people are under pressure. Somebody who's, stove is on fire and they're figuring out what the hell to do with it. versus their cakes won't rise properly, and you're supposed to tell them what. I mean, it was all. So I said, okay, so you're gonna have to probably a calming thing and so forth. And so I do my little psychological research, which is there was no internet to do this on, so I went to the library and looked it up and talked to some people who I knew were interested. And so we ended up with this kind of rose, uh, pinkish rose kind of color on the inside. And I said, this is the color you should use. They said, this is great. And I'm thinking, what? Who am I? If they like it, great. And I said, but wait a minute, there's business here. Uh, in terms of being able to, I mean, literally, that was the kind of thing that got me into people asking me because I was teaching them about how teams develop in the organizational behavior class, the IO psychology class. How do teams develop? What are the fundamentals of motivation? How can you shape that? What's the role of management in that? And so that's what we were learning in the classes. And so I became doc. I was like the expert, but I would like to say that I had this clear career path, but in fact, it was the external environment posing questions to me that led me to think about how do the things that I learned about how from developmental psychology, from how what the fundamentals of motivation, from personality theory, from what is it that makes people want to succeed and what are the basics of success and how do people define it and so forth, and how does that translate into an organizational setting. But it was less me sitting down with this strategic plan and worksheet and a wall chart or something like that, rather than it was responding to questions that the market, if you want to call it that, were asking me.
So that you're in a dialogue with managers and people who are like unit supervisors, and they're trying to figure out how to create a more kind of productive kind of environment.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Or as it turned out a bit later, it was helping uh, people as I drifted more. I taught at Bellarmine for 6 years full time, 4 classes a semester, 4 separate preparations every semester, and 2 in the summer. So it was a full time job, and I was making less than $20,000 a year on it. But that was more money back in the 1970s than it is now. But it was not quite enough because we were starting our family and so forth, and it was I said need to make a little more money,
Yeah.
and so I ended up applying to a consulting firm that was based in Louisville, but yeah, it was being drawn by questions because remember we're coming out of the of course 50s and 60s were this period of phenomenal post-war growth in the economy, in the businesses, factories were expanding. There were lots of jobs. People were buying homes who had never had homes before in their entire lives. And so all these things were happening. And companies were in expansion mode even into the 1970s, which is where we are now. We're kind of mid 70s in the career. And so,
But there's even at that time, though, in labor history, this is an interesting time period because it's also, the Vietnam War, a lot of people coming back, leaving, coming back, Lordstown, the famous
right,
the blue collar, what they call the blue collar rebellion
at GM, yeah.
at GM, and I think as you're talking about organizational behavior, Steve, I was thinking of in labor history and industrial relations, we read about the Hawthorne experiments at GE, in the 20s and that and kind of the mixed results from those things. So was that the kind of thing you were that was influencing your work or in kind of informing your work?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean the Hawthorne, that's a whole separate story, but because there were problems with that study, but it had to do with recognition and self-fulfilling work that was fulfilling in and of itself, and feedback, and there were all sorts of variables that were looked at. But it said the breakthrough part of it for me is it said that these kinds of things that we see as just routine work, like working on a Henry Ford assembly line, can actually be studied, and it can enhance the experience both for the worker and for the company in terms of productivity. So that was the big breakthrough, although there were all kinds of flaws with the study. But this was an era where people were casting about for what were the kinds of solutions, and a belief that there was an increasing belief that how you dealt with all these people had a lot to do with it. And so they tended to turn to people who were experts. And by then, I was doc. I was like supposedly an expert, although I was frankly making it up, not making it up, but I was trying to apply sound scientific methodology, even though in many cases it was the assignment that I was on was the first time I've ever done one of those. And so I was learning and they were learning, but that was okay because everybody sort of recognized that we were breaking new ground. So you're right. We had vets coming back. We had increasing number of people who were going to college, first generation, who were graduating from college with a different set of expectations that had been created partially by the colleges that they went to about what they should expect when they go to the workforce. And it was not just installing a carburetor on a Ford day in and day out the same job. It's not this was back in the days of carburetors. I still actually know how to rebuild a carburetor actually. But it was a different. There were different sets of expectations. You were managing a different kind of workforce. You were managing vets who were coming back who'd had stunning experiences for better or worse as part of that. And the question was, how did that relate to the workplace? And so that led me, again, I left Bellarmine to make some more money and went to work for a consulting firm at that time called Meidinger, which was based in Louisville. It had about 600 consultants, which was a pretty good sized group. And we were kind of in the Southeast and Midwest and partially in the Northeast. But it was mainly benefits and compensation. But we had in that group a thing called the Communications Consulting Group. And so to give you an example of the transition, stop me if I'm not answering your question. One of our clients was Pittsburgh National Bank, which ended up is now called PNC, Pittsburgh National Corporation. And this was an era where, given all those social transitions that you were just describing, companies were looking at benefits packages. At that time, what would happen is if you went to a job at Pittsburgh National or Pittsburgh Bank at that point, where we had a big office, on your first day of the job, they would have you in the orientation session, right? You go in and you'd have like 2 days of orientation. And one of the first things he would give you is a binder. And everybody would get the same binder. It says, here's your benefits. Well, the problem is that the workforce was changing. We were beginning to have women entering the workforce in greater numbers. People who had different expectations and different skill sets, different expectations for where their career was going to take them, how they were going to plan for their future, how many kids they were going to have, where they lived, all that kind of stuff was happening. And they had aging parents. And so their needs did not fit conveniently into a single binder. Pittsburgh Bank became the one of the first, I'm not sure it was exactly the first, but certainly one of the first companies to experiment with the idea of flexible benefits, where there were actually choices being made in how people, might allocate the benefits dollars in ways that were most beneficial. No one had ever done that before. You want to know what your benefits are? Here's your binder. Just look it up. And so the bank came to us and said, we don't think this is meeting our. We have some people who are delighted with what we have, but other people are saying, you're spending all this money on it, but here's what I really need. I need something to deal with childcare, or I need more on health benefits, or I want to put more. I'm at this point in my life, we're all healthy. I want more towards retirement. And so our challenge was, and we had people who are communication specialists, literally, they could produce videos, they could do all this kind of stuff. And there were 3 of us who were on the team who were psychologists. And so our job became to find out how can you design a flexible benefits program where you spend the same amount of money or approximately on your benefits package, but you meet more people's needs. And so our job became, again, using the psychology thing, to do focus groups, surveys, which we knew how to design. And so to find out if people had certain amounts of money to spend, how would they spend it, and how would they be able to make that decision? And remembering that nobody had ever been asked to make that decision before. All they were done was given the binder. So we built a communication. We did, first of all, a found out here's what people say they want. Then we would go to our actuaries in our consulting firm. This is where all the masters and PhDs in mathematics go to. They become actuaries, and truly, that was the kind of people who were working there. And they would run the numbers in terms of if people allocate, if they decide this way, here's what it's going to cost. And if you want to stay within this price boundary, here's what you have. So we didn't do that part, but we provided the input for what it was that people wanted on the job. That was the psychology part of it.
Okay.
But then we came up with various models. We worked with the bank to say, okay, here's how much we have to spend, allocated the best. So then we created trial experiments where live members of their corporation. Actually, we had to figure out a way, how do we communicate this thing? They've never been asked to make this decision before, to project themselves out to what am I going to need in retirement? And if I have this amount of money to spend, how am I going to spend it? So we went to toy stores and we looked at games and we were trying to think of ways that we could communicate this thing. We ended up with a thing which is, what is it, cross-4? It's a thing where you put little things that look like poker chips into a grid and you stack them up.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
It's something 4. I'm blocking on the name of it right now.
Yeah, Connect 4.
Connect 4, that's it.
Yeah.
And so we said, okay, each of these tokens, we gave them different colored tokens, just like different poker chips would be. And said, okay, this one's worth 5% of your money. Here, this one's worth 10%. This one's worth 50. You know what? And here's 5 columns: retirement, healthcare, childcare, things that we might be able to offer you. Allocate your chips according to that. And so we did a controlled experiment, sort of a psychological experiment as to how people allocated it. Went back to our actuaries, redefined all the things. The Pittsburgh Bank decided what they could afford. And then our job was, how do we communicate it to all the rest of the group? So we ended up, there was a TV show at the time called WKRP in Cincinnati, which some people may remember was a comedy show. It was funny. But it was the guy who was the station manager in the show, who was really hilarious. And we hired him to be the spokesperson for this thing. And so we created videos for people to understand how to use literally the model. And we sent them out and people could allocate their chips.
Wow.
And that was the first time that a flexible benefits program had ever been researched to say, how is it going to work? Designed and then implemented and then communicated to the employees. So we got what is called, there's an organization called the International Association of Internet Business Communicators. We got the Golden Quill Award for the best comprehensive program encompassing both research, behavioral science, communications, implementation, financing, and all that into a single thing. So that was the kind of work that we were doing. But if you would have told me when I was back riding the circuit in rural Kentucky that was what I was going to be working on, I could not have possibly told you that. But all the pieces, I mean, just fell into place.
Yeah, I mean, there's an earlier generation. I'm trying to think again, industrial, like labor relations. The most prominent thing I can think of was, the Ford Motor Company had a Department of Social Work in the 1920s, but it was very different. It was tied to Henry Ford's promise of the $5 day.
Right.
But the workers had, I'm sure you know this, but the workers in that program had to meet certain standards. And so there was this kind of Department of Social Work where people would go out into the workers' homes to make sure that they weren't allowing boarders to stay with them, or they weren't drinking, or they, doing this or that. But then tied to that was also the Ford Service Department, which was like the strong arm part of that, which said, you could have the $5 a day, but if you try to organize or you talk back to your foreman, Ford's friend, who's a former boxer, his name was Bennett, who was the head of the Ford Service Company. And this became notorious, like, Great Depression incident where Walter Reuther, who was the head of the United Auto Workers Union, was beaten up by some of the Ford service men. But Ford had a kind of an attempt to do something, but it was very much more top down, ostensibly tied to, the best wages in the industry kind of thing. Benefits were not really that. There was a pension at Ford, but it was we would call it, I'll just use the term miserly.
Yeah.
But there was a pension in the 20s. You could accrue points, but you're talking about a very different kind of model where you're actually asking workers kind of what they would choose within a limited, within a universe where you do have to make those choices. You can't have, one chip has to allocate a certain percentage. You have 4 chips. In other words, you can't have 100% in healthcare, 100% here. You have to really kind of divide them up, right?
Right. Well, and it wasn't like Pittsburgh National, or for that matter, Henry Ford, came saying that the living wage and so forth is just a great idea. It was probably a rational decision to say, first of all, we need productivity, or we
Yeah.
need employees. We got to get this stuff done. But I'm sure that Ford started from the premise of how can we get the most out of the people that we have with the money that we're putting into it. And so not only were there things about unions, but there were also issues around how fast can you move a car down the line, so that now we can do it. Basically, Ford will tell you now that they can produce 1 vehicle per minute, is basically the sort of a rule of thumb standard. You couldn't do that back in the 20s or whenever it happened to be. But so it started with a standard business formulation of, man, our benefits costs are just exploding, and we want to be competitive in the pay realm, but now pay and benefits are becoming kind of a package, and people are looking at it. So if we got this amount of money to spend, which is a reasonable question, if you're the executive, you got to say, here's how much money we're bringing in, here's what we can spend on staffing in our budget, how are we going to do it? So it was kind of a forced engagement with employees having preferences and needs and things like that. But it did not proceed initially from the goodness of their heart. But there was certainly an understanding of having satisfied employees, who feel like the company's looking out for them. And in fact, sound psychological research where people feel like they have some agency in terms of
Yeah.
making decisions and ways to influence what's happening to them, is a way that people really feel connected with their employer and with the company and with the job that they're doing. So all these things were in many cases a pleasant storm, but they were not out of the goodness of the milk of human kindness swelling from the executive teams at these companies. They have a real problem, and we were able to say, is because we'd worked with them on designing their previous benefits programs, to say, look, what would happen if there was a way that you could give people some choice,
Yeah.
and take the same amount of money, or a little bit less or a little bit more, but anyway, maximize its efficacy, but give the employee the feeling that they had a hand in shaping it, at least at
Right.
some level. And how much level could we give them? And that was where the whole actuarial and communications and all that stuff came in. So, like I said, but I think all these things were coming together. There was an expectation set coming from the workforce that they wanted to be respected. that they wanted to have power, that they wanted to have agency on their own. There were companies who, some of whom had come up through that thing and were recognizing, hey, that was me, 10 years ago, and sort of recognizing what it was, the issues they were dealing with. And then we, as outside consultants, could say, okay, here we can help you design some tools that will make that happen. And it was a combination of sound business management, uh, budgeting, systems that would support it, because we had to have systems people who, for example, if suddenly employees start making decisions, you got to have somebody who can manage all that stuff. Like, and this was, the computers were not particularly great at that point. They were all mainframe
Right.
operations, and it wasn't like people could sit at their laptop and key in what their choices were. There had to be all this paperwork and education things and all that stuff that happened. And so
Yeah.
it was all these threads coming together, but it was actually quite an exciting time as well, of saying, how do we make all this complicated stuff work?
Yeah. Wow. That's it. It sounds like some of it is, obviously there's research and thought and theory going into it, but a lot of the work was kind of, learning as you went along, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And everybody knew that, because no one else had done it before. And so we would say, we're going to try this. I mean, some of it just didn't work at all. I mean, the choice mechanism did not get communicated right, and then there was sort of chaos. But part of the communications plan we had to put in place was, hey, workers, this is a new thing. We're experimenting with it. There's probably going to be some glitches, but we're going to work them out. But we set up feedback loops. So during a 2-year implementation process, we put in continual feedback loops with teams who could respond to them quickly. And again, it was not, as I said, out of the milk of human kindness that people were doing this. They were trying to maximize the productivity of their benefits expansion, and to satisfy employees in the process. And so these things are not competing interests. I mean, and even the employees understand there's X amount of money. You can't just give money out.
Right. Yeah.
They understand that in their own home budget.
Right. Exactly. Well, Steve, we should wrap up. We've
Okay.
gone another hour, and I think we want, if you're interested and you have time, we'll be interested to do, one additional session, because I want to eventually get to the work you talked with me earlier, kind of anecdotally with Sears. And so maybe let's say that for part 3, but let me ask you one final question. And you're the one who raised this. It's a cultural question, because you mentioned the show WKRP Cincinnati. And the question I have is kind of convoluted. In your mind, who are the types? You talked, there's a certain culture back then in the early 70s, mid 70s. It's a time of tumult, and I guess I'm asking you to compare it with almost like now, because we're also, as you know, in this new time period where a lot of our recent actually a lot of our college students now are told, well, hey, we may have told you to go into coding 5 or 8 years ago, but if you go into coding now, you're finished, because AI is going to take everything. But then the cultural component, I guess. Another iconic program I remember as a kid was Archie Bunker, or All in the Family.
Yeah.
What was the kind of culture of the workplace back then? I realize that's kind of a big question, but when you were designing these experiments and trying to think about this new terrain, what were your ideas of the culture of workers back then?
Well, and we can talk more about this when we look a bit further in the future. But I would say we had one foot in the glory days, the expansion, sky's the limit,
Yeah.
50s and 60s, interrupted by nasty things like Vietnam and so forth. But nevertheless, the economy and business was expanding, home ownership was expanding, all those things were going on. So there was kind of an expectation in the workforce that, you know, if you work, if you work hard and love your mother, there's always room at the top, was the phrase that people would toss around.
Yeah.
And that, so there was an expectation of continued growth and so forth. But there was this gnawing sense of, especially I found among my friends, I did not go to Vietnam, by the way. That's another story. But I had many friends and was very involved in the whole process who came back with a somewhat jaded set of expectations about how they were being treated and what their prospects were and so forth. And finding out that when they came back, things were starting to max out in a way beyond that sort of explosive expansion. It was leveling out as that was a natural thing, not because someone was planning it, but you just couldn't, the pace was exponential kind of growth could not be sustained because the exponent became unattainable. So I think there was a kind of a realization with a sort of settling down. I'm going to need to get into something that I can be satisfied with. But at the same time, having just looked around over your shoulder and saying, but wait a minute, we've got 25 years experience now of things having been terrific. And so there was a real kind of a sense, my sense was a sense of reckoning about what is it I'm going to do and what are my expectations.
Okay.
So on the one hand, a sense of realism that not everything is a golden horizon that I'm looking at. But on the other hand, there's real potential, but I want to have a hand in shaping that. There was a sense of wanting to have this sense of personal efficacy rather than fitting into a slot which is predefined. And working at a company and going to GE and working there for 37 years, there was already the sense of that's not going to be the future.
Yeah.
Now we've got that in spades.
Right. Well, yeah, I remember.
It can't even depend on your not just your company, but even your job. I mean, how many legal analysts are going to be doing all the paperwork for legal cases, and so it's going to be AI for crying out loud.
Well, yeah, I mean, the school that I did my BA at when I transferred from community college in the late 80s, Evergreen State College was founded on that very premise in the late 60s. The idea was the days in which you were going to work in one job for 30 to 45 years was over. And the idea that even that majoring in something and planning to use that major to go into the workforce was outmoded. And I didn't realize educational theory behind Evergreen until, you get older and you go back and look at it. And I'm like, well, yeah, we didn't have cookie cutter classes. You took a whole program the whole year, and it was much more geared around kind of broader analytical writing, critical thinking skills, and much less, we're going to plug you into a firm or even into a niche in the workplace because the niches are constant. And I remember them telling us, you're going to move, and our faculty would tell us, you're going to move 5 or 8 times throughout the course of your work life. It isn't going to be like your parents who probably you grew up in a place, your children are not going to have that experience. And my dad, his experience was 35 years in the Puget Sound Naval Federal Shipyard and, retired military and all that stuff. And yet that is part of the astonishing transition that was taking place, in the 70s and 80s, which if you look back at it now, it was a huge, huge shift, and so, yeah.
Well, even when I was teaching, that was part of what I said, and I would use my career trajectory as an example to say there is no way in hell I could have possibly forecast what I was going to end up doing.
Right.
No matter how smart I was when I graduated college, it has unfolded completely. So and even when I was teaching here at UF, I would say that learn all that stuff. I want to teach about retailing and things like that. But retailing is just since I've left teaching here has changed phenomenally because of online and Amazon and all that kind of stuff. Uh,
Yeah.
but it's you and it's made me an even more profound supporter of liberal education to say learning how to think, learning how to learn that's what's going to distinguish you and demonstrating that you can look at problems from a variety of different perspectives, the different kinds of analytic tools and so forth. And you can learn the other stuff because most companies will say, look, I can teach you what it is you need to do this particular job. But what I need is somebody who is capable of learning it. And
Yeah.
that's what we need. And so I've been saying that to students for 20 years because I could see it happening. But I had my own experience to say that the stuff that has served me best has been that fundamental learning how to learn stuff, which sounds like a cliche now, but damn, it's true.
It is so true, right? Yeah. Well, speaking of learning how to learn, I got to shade off here, Steve, because I have to work with two graduate students who hopefully are going to be learning how to learn in the academic job market of tomorrow or today.